Okay, so I'm gonna redo my cut and key video because I noticed that I'm doing things just a tiny bit differently. There's a little bit of a change in 2.93, and well, 2.93 is around, right? And I know I prefer tutorials on the current version of Blender, so we're gonna redo it. And very little has changed. I do things just a tiny bit differently, and I'll explain why as we go along. So here is the model we're going to cut up. It's a little ray gun keychain, and you can see it's a small thing. It's a keychain, right? And look at all of these tiny little indents and things like that. If we were to print it, like with this part facing the bed, and you'd have to have supports all in here, it would be a nightmare to clean up. It would add time to the print. It would waste plastic, and it's a pain, right? So even if we printed it like this, right, with this part here down flat against the bed, we'd need supports all on this underside, and they would get all up in here, and it would be really difficult to clean up, and it would make it not really worth printing, in my opinion. So this is why we cut and key. We'll cut the model in half. We'll have three parts. We'll have part one, a key, and part two, and it will print without supports, and it will print beautifully, and it will save you a lot of time and a lot of hassle. So let's show you how we can do that. Okay, so we got our part centered. Let's add a cube. Now right now the cube is so large, it's 2,000 millimeters, it's encompassing the entire scene, so let's shrink it down so it appears. And then we're going to hit S to scale it on SX to scale it on the X axis. And then we'll move it down, and we hit SZ to scale it on the Z axis, and we're going to scale it a little more. Basically all it has to do is encapsulate the model, but I like a little space, right? And then I usually go and double check. Now that is pretty good, right? Hit X-ray. It's not really perfect. It looks like it's a shade closer on this side. I can move it over. But it doesn't really matter. You don't have to be like on the atomic level perfectly centered. As long as you are close enough, you're good. Right? So now we're going to save this, because we want this cutter saved in the main file. And I'll show you what I mean by main file in a second. So now we're going to select the part. We'll go into the modifiers and select boolean. Now here is a tiny bit of a difference. The difference modifier has two different types of solvers. Now, from what I understand, fast is the solver that we're used to. It's the one we've always used. Exact is what it does. If we go here, right now I'm going to select the cutter, I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll move it out a little bit, and then we'll scale it on the X. Now you see all of this crazy shimmery stuff going on here? In here is what's happening is the planes for each box are on the exact same level, so they're sort of interacting with one another. And if you were to try to cut it, oops, and you can click on it. In this case, there's only two, but I like the eyedropper. See how the whole thing now has gone funny? Now it means you're probably going to get messy geometry, and you're going to have to clean it up, or it's going to be a nightmare. However, if you click exact, it takes that into account. It fixes everything, and you get a nice, neat, clean cut. However, we're not doing that kind of cut today. All right, let's get rid of that. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to cut it in half. So we make sure deference, fast, and then we select the box, and there you go, cuts it right in half. We're going over here and apply the cut. And now we've cut the model exactly in half. Groovy, groovy. I like to come in here, add a 1 to it so that I know that this is side 1. Now it's really important that you do not move this. You want to keep it exactly where it is, and I'll show you why in a bit. So we're going to go File, Save As. So important that you save as. You don't want to save over the original yet. You want to create a new file, right? So we're going to call this Raygun Mini 1. So we have a new file with this half of the model in it. Now we've saved that. We're going to go open recent, and we're going to go back to the main file. Now, here's where the magic happens. We select the cube, and then we go back here, and we take this, and we slide it over. Now, this has not moved the face that's cutting the middle of the model. It's in exactly the same spot, so it will bisect the model exactly in half. So now you have the other half of the model. However, here's the thing. You want to go back into edit mode by hitting tab. I'm going to hit A to select all. Then you want to go into mesh, and you want to go down here to normals, and you want to recalculate the outside. And why you want to do that is because if you don't recalculate the normals, this will create a non-manifold cut, which is easily fixable, but this will save you from having to fix it. So we're going to select the model. We're going to go to modifiers, boolean, deference, fast, eyedropper, select the cube. There we go. And it cuts it right in half. We're going to apply it. And we'll delete the cube. I do like to check these just to make sure. Select, bitrate, non-manifold. Good. If you send a non-manifold model over to your slicer, it's not going to print well. Okay, so now we have the other half. I like to name it. Right, so we're going to add a 2 into that, and then we're going to go File, Save As. Don't want to save over anything yet. I like to keep all 3 parts. Maybe I got to go back. I got to fix something. I got to do something. So then I'll have the main one with the cutter in it. I'll have part 1 and part 2. I'll have all the pieces. Now this is just me. I prefer to do the cutting and the keying in part 1. It doesn't really matter. You can do it in part 2. You can do it in part 1. You can create another file and do it in that. It's up to you. So we're going to save this because we've renamed it as a new file. And then I'm going to go open recent, part 1. And I'm going to go file, append. Yeah. We go Raygun Mini 2, object, and boom. Now, because you didn't move anything, it's brought it in exactly lined up perfectly with part 1. You are good to go as is like this. So now I'm going to select part 1, and I'm going to hit H to hide it. Now, I am going to hit Shift right mouse button to move this 3D cursor exactly on the face of the model. And why that's helpful is when you go Add Mesh Cube, and let's shrink that down so we can see it. Look, it puts it perfectly in the center of the model, so you don't have to mess around with moving it back and forth to get it perfectly centered. As you can see, it's a little too close to that outer edge, and your slicer will probably leave a hole in the model. So let's see what we have. We're at 10 for the Y. Now that's way bigger than it needs to be. So we can definitely cut that down. And even the Z, look how tall that is. That's way taller than it needs to be. And then I'm going to scale it on the X. And you can scale it whatever you want. The bigger keys are just easier to deal with. I like everything to be nice, even numbers. And that's going to be my key. Right? So now we're going to have all 3 parts of this. Part 1, the key, and part 2 in part 1 of the file. So now we're ready to cut the hole for this key. And I like my keys to be kind of snug because really for me the main point of them is so that when I'm gluing parts together they don't slide around, right? Because there's nothing worse than when you've got mismatched sides and you can't really fix it because there's too much detail and now you got to print it over again. That's really what my keys are for. And also, someone had asked me why I don't leave the key in one side in the comments of the previous video. And this is pretty much why. Like, let's pretend we were going to print this face down on the bed, right? This side. You'd have to add supports for all this underside. And while this would be easier to clean up, like I said, I don't want to waste plastic. I don't want to add time to my print. I just want to I want a flat side on all of my parts so that they can sit flat on the bed, so I don't have to clean up any supports. I don't have to throw away any plastic that I could have used. I don't have to add time to my prints. So this is why I cut and key, to make models easier and faster to print. Okay, so now one other thing. In the other video, okay, so you have to, if I was to cut a slot for this key exactly the same size as the key, it would not fit. There's just, 3D printing, especially, I have an Ender 3, they're not super exact. The plastic expands a little bit. You have, over extrusion. You have whatever the issue is, the key will not fit. And I was using, I believe, 0.17 of a millimeter before, and it was just too little, and I ended up spending a lot of time sanding, which is why I like to use square keys, right? It's easier to hold on to, easier to sand. If you use round keys, one, they're harder to print, and two, they're a nightmare to sand. So I prefer using square keys. And also I've started uniforming my keys. So 5 millimeters is kind of a regular size for me, because that way, let's say you have a model with 5 keys in it, and if all the keys are the same size, you don't have to go hunt to see which key fits in which slot. You can grab any key and put it in any slot and you'll be good, right? However, I make them a little bit, I do them a little bit differently. So 0.17 of a millimeter was way too small. But let's look at how we're going to print this, right? So we're going to print this like this, right? This is going to be flat on the bed. Now I use a duct parts cooler so that it makes bridging better. But even though it bridges well, it still sags a little on the top. So since this y-axis here is going to be the top, I add a little more space on my y-axis than I do on the other axes. So for the x on this, I'm going to add 25, oh wait, let's do half a millimeter, right? So that means that's 1/4 of a millimeter on each side. Now the y, I'm going to add 1 millimeter, because both parts of this, both parts of this are going to have a top, and they're both going to sag a little bit. So you want just that extra space, right? And now this one, I'm just going to add 5.5 millimeter. Now, if you always add the same amount of space, it's going to be easy to remember how much to remove when you save your key. And you have to make sure you remove this extra space, otherwise your key won't fit. So I'm going to select the model, go into my boolean modifiers, on difference, fast, select the key, apply it, and here we'll hide it, and you can see we have a nice keyhole. Now select the model, I'll hit tab, I'll go on X-ray, and I'm just going to check and make sure that it's non-manifold, and it is. Or that it's manifold. Okay, so now we will hide this part. We'll go to part 1. We'll rename that key. Okay, now I'll hit Control 1 to show me the opposite side, and then we'll do the same thing all over again. We'll select the model. We'll go Boolean, fast, deference, fast. We'll select the key. Apply the cut. Hide the key for just a second. Take a look at the cut. And then we'll check it. And it's good. Okay, now at this point, I'm going to unhide everything. And I'm going to save everything in part 1, right? So now I have all 3 pieces of this model in part 1. I've saved it. I'm going to save it again just because I'm paranoid. Now, here's where it gets tricky. You got to be really careful that you don't save over things. I'm going to select part 1 and part 2, and then I'm going to delete them. Right? So now we have just the key. I'm going to go File, Save As. Really important, you save as. If you save over something, you will be unhappy. Now I'm going to rename this key. And I'm also going to File, Export, STL. Now I have a little directory structure here that I always use. And we're going to save the key in the STL folder. Then I'll go File, Save, Open Recent. We'll go back to 1. Now, I'm going to delete part 1. Be really careful with this. You can screw things up here and you'll be sorry. So now we have part 2. Now I'm going to go File, Save As. I'm going to save part 2. Now sometimes Blender doesn't want to save over. I really don't know why this is. Let's see if we have problems. No, it saved it fine. If it won't save over the original part 2, I just save it as part 2 and I put a B. And then I go back and I delete the original part 2. I rename the one that has the B in it to just 2, and you're good. So what I'll do here, we'll go to 3. Now I'll hit R for rotate minus 90. Right? Now that's going to move it nice and flat. I'll hit 7 to go up. Now I like to print with the long part of the print on the y-axis. Supposedly it's more accurate. I don't know if that's true. It's just what I've got in the habit of doing. Okay, so now we'll go File, Export, STL. Go back to the STL folder. It's already named Raygun Mini 2 STL, so we'll export it. I will save it again because I'm paranoid, and then we'll go Open Recent, Part 1. Now, we have the key and we have Part 2 saved in their own file, so we don't need them in here anymore. Right? Make sure you've selected the right thing, Part 2 and the key. This is why naming helps. You can make sure that you don't delete something you need. So I will hit X and then delete. Now we have Part 1 in its own file. I'll save that. And then I'm going to hit R for rotate 90. And 7 just to check its orientation, and it's fine. So now I will go File, Export, STL, back to the STL folder, and then we're good. We're done with this part. Okay, we can save that. Now let's go to Cura. Okay, here's Cura, opened up and ready. And let's go into my STL folder, and here's my 3 parts. Now look at this. They come in perfectly, right? Look at those parts are flat on the bottom. Everything's set up. The only thing I would change is this. Like I said, I like to print the long part on the y-axis. I don't know if it really matters. And I would probably also, just because I like to keep everything as close to the center as possible. You know what, I even think I would do this. Let's see. Nah, I don't like that either. I like to keep things as close to the center of the bed as humanly possible. That's really what's worked out best for me. Flip that around that way. Okay, and see, and this is going to give you a beautiful print, right? No supports to clean up. It's going to be near perfect. So that's how I cut and key in Blender 2.93. So I just happen to have a print of the file I just showed you. And as you can see, here is the cut and keyed version. And let's see how well you can see. That printed great, right?